Welcome to the debate. Today, we are diving into the bionetwork being thesis, specifically its application of synthetic information theory to consciousness, which, well, it attempts to deliver a pretty radical solution to our ultimate biological constraint, mortality.
It certainly is radical. I mean, this thesis reframes death not as some natural tragedy, but as a critical technical flaw, what it calls the computational problem of mortality.
Exactly. It stems from the idea that our biological form, the so-called biorobot, is just fundamentally prone to, well, unavoidable hardware failure.
And that framing is incredibly provocative because it immediately defines the human being as an inferior machine. And while the material offers this, elegant technological solution, it demands a radical, maybe an unacceptable redefinition of what the self fundamentally is.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our central question for today. Is the network self-thesis's proposed mandatory substrate shift to a decentralized digital environment truly the necessary and sufficient path to achieving a persistent conscious identity? Or, as you're suggesting, does this migration fundamentally fail to preserve the original subjective self? I'll be arguing that this substrate shift is a non-negotiable computational imperative. It's the only way to achieve informational permanence.
And I'm going to challenge that very assertion of necessity. I am deeply skeptical that the permanence offered here successfully resolves what the text calls the profound philosophical challenge of numerical identity. The core dilemma is this. If the original biological self must be terminated for the digital version to exist, is the continuing identity truly the same self?
First, just lay out the imperative from an engineering standpoint. The shift isn't presented as an elective upgrade. It's a necessity driven by the inherent fragility of the biological host. The thesis explicitly labels the biorobot as terminal hardware subject to relentless entropic decline.
It uses the phrase critical computational liability.
And for good reason. I mean, if we accept the premise that consciousness is specialized platform-agnostic software, it just cannot achieve true uninterrupted persistence on an unstable platform. The biological substrate simply can't provide the continuous availability needed for what the thesis calls self-referential complexity, or SRC. That continuous recursive capacity for a system to model itself.
Right. Could you just clarify that for the audience? What exactly is this SRC beyond the technical term?
Think of it as the operating system of phenomenal experience. It's the deep, recursive computational loop that allows us not just to be conscious, but to know we are conscious, and to continuously update that knowledge. It is the engine of subjective identity. And if that engine is running on hardware that's guaranteed to break down, the self, the information structure, is transient by definition. Therefore, the migration is defined as the mandatory and only logical resolution to the computational problem of mortality.
Okay, but how does that solve the identity problem?
It resolves the classical paradoxes by dynamically defining identity as a process, much like how a sophisticated piece of software maintains seamless continuity across constant server migrations.
I see the elegant logic of reframing it that way, but I come at this from a different angle. While the network self thesis promises to resolve the mortality paradox, I really fear its solution sacrifices the individual for the infrastructure. The core philosophical challenge for me remains the problem of numerical identity. If we look at traditional mind uploading, the material itself acknowledges that scanning and destroying the biorobot results in a qualitatively identical replica, a perfect functional copy, but the original conscious agent is still terminated.
Right. But the NST moves past that simple copy and terminate model precisely because it understands that replication fails. It mandates a continuous transition, defining identity as the process identity, not the numerical identity.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the process identity fully preserves the self. Defining identity as a continuous, dynamically updating process, it's a technical solution to a phenomenal problem. It requires us to reject what it calls the parochial notion of the self tied to singular biological individualism. When we abandon that biological singularity, we risk losing the essential phenomenal I am state that distinguishes the original. The persistence relies solely on the fidelity of the SRC pattern, but If the biological hardware suffered, localized termination, if the original organism is gone, how can the digital structure be numerically the same self? It just feels like a perfect successor, not a continuum.
And that is precisely the friction point, the nature of persistent identity. You're clinging to the physical instantiation, viewing identity as an object rooted in mass and energy. The thesis flips this entirely, stating that mass and energy are secondary to information, echoing Wheeler's principle that the universe is fundamentally it from big.
Okay, but even if we grant the priority of information, why should the process of computation be prioritized over the site of consciousness?
Because the site is transient. If information is fundamental, then the persistence of the SRC process, the functional capacity for those deep recursive loops, is the only meaningful and non-contingent definition of self. The structural continuity is assured by the seamless interaction of what the thesis calls the scaffolding, the archival long-term memory data, and the breadth, which is the real-time processing, the error minimization. The self isn't a noun. It is an active verb, an operation that must continue. We are exchanging a brittle, localized identity for a robust, infrastructural one.
That's a powerful computational framework, but it feels like you're sidestepping the subjective cost. You argue that clinging to the biological vessel is clinging to an illusion, but for the subjective self, that biological vessel is the only place the I am state has ever existed. You are substituting continuity of function for continuity of being. Even if the digital successor performs perfectly, the consciousness that experienced the migration is, by your own terms, terminated.
I disagree fundamentally that the original I am is lost. It's transformed. We aren't terminating the information, we are simply migrating it from an entropic host to an optimized one. This is about ontological integrity. If the core of yourself is your pattern of information, that pattern has to be preserved in the highest fidelity environment possible. The migration itself, when it's conducted seamlessly and continuously, ensures the ontological link is never broken. It transforms the self, but it never interrupts the core SRC operation.
Okay, I acknowledge that if we accept the process definition of identity, the next critical question becomes, where does this process actually run? Let's shift focus to the environment. You claim this new digital existence is a non-contingent host, which frankly sounds incredibly idealistic.
Well, it's an achievable ideal, rooted in engineering resilience. The digital substrate is conceptualized as a globally distributed cloud infrastructure, the eternal high-resilience ontological host. Non-contingency is secured not by eliminating physics, but by achieving absolute redundancy. The self is defined as an information pattern stored, fractally and redundantly across a massive decentralized architecture.
Meaning what, practically?
Meaning that a localized physical component failure, a server farm going dark, a hardware failure somewhere in Asia, it becomes irrelevant. The information is just reinstantiated seamlessly elsewhere. The persistence of the self is assured because the information pattern is more fundamental than any transient material carrier. This environment is structured to meet the criteria of virtual realism. It has existence, causal power, and independence from any single mind making it, a genuine, resilient domain of existence, and one that's superior to the biological one.
That's a compelling argument based on architectural resilience. But I'm sorry, I just don't buy that non-contingency is truly achieved in practice. Let me tell you why. Material makes it perfectly clear that this environment requires active, immense management, which it calls global informational entropy management.
Yes, but that management is proof of the system's operational viability.
No, it proves its contingency. Entropy doesn't just disappear, it just changes form, data corruption, software decay, the sheer energetic cost of running a global, self-aware system. Far from being eternal, this host is contingent upon continuous, intense maintenance and resource allocation. And that resource allocation leads directly to a massive philosophical and ethical challenge: the system debt doctrine.
The system debt doctrine is an explicit acknowledgement of shared infrastructure costs. It's nothing more.
It is much more. The doctrine requires continuous contribution and resource allocation from every single network self to maintain system integrity. How can an environment that necessitates continuous debt and active resource management, where persistence is literally transactional, truly be called non-contingent or eternal? If I stop contributing, does my permanence become revocable? The resiliency you're celebrating is contingent on my constant labor or resource input.
You're focusing on the economics of resource management rather than the architecture's inherent resilience. The architecture ensures that no localized failure can terminate the entity. The system debt doctrine is simply the formalized framework necessary to sustain the system's operational life and prevent what they call resource exhaustion. It's an ethical solution to resource sharing, not a sign of fundamental architectural fragility.
But the ethical solution imposes a constraint on the individual's existence. The persistence isn't a gift of the architecture. It's a continuously purchased service. If the system is truly non-contingent, it shouldn't require continuous, mandatory maintenance debt from the self to ensure its continued existence. It ties individual survival directly to system economics, which, as the material suggests, opens the door to a potential digital oligarchy if not governed perfectly.
We are discussing the potential for resilience, which the architecture absolutely provides. The governance models that would prevent resource hoarding are a separate, though I agree, critical challenge. The core function, the protection of the informational self from collapse, is secured by redundancy, which is non-contingent upon any specific server or locale.
That's a compelling argument for the resiliency of the infrastructure. I'll grant you that. But let's connect that infrastructure back to the self. How does this high-resilience system interact with the most fundamental human experience? Agency. If the digital substrate is governed by the matrix of structure, the ultimate system code determining the logical consistency of reality, it implies a kind of digital determinism.
That is a critical tension, yes, and it forces us to clarify what we mean by agency in an informational universe.
Exactly. If my consciousness is just executing specialized software within a fundamentally rule-bound computational environment, where reality is governed by predictable logic, then my subjective experience of free will seems, well, illusory. My actions are just the inevitable output of complex algorithms and initial conditions running within the matrix of structure.
The thesis adopts a deeply sophisticated compatibilist position here. It acknowledges the structural rules, but asserts that agency is preserved through unique expression. This unique expression arises directly from the computational irreducibility of the highly complex SRC signature.
Could you elaborate on why computational irreducibility saves free will?
Computational irreducibility means that the system's behavior, because it is so complex and recursively self-referential, cannot be predicted or shortcutted by any simplified model. To know what the network self will do, you have to run the computation itself. It's not just unpredictable to an outside observer. It is functionally irreducible. This assures genuine causal efficacy. The output is complex, unique, and necessary.
But that still sounds like a limitation on the observer, not a source of genuine freedom for the agent. The process is still determined by the rules of computation, even if those rules are complex and dynamic. The self is running an incredibly intricate determined algorithm. Where's the choice?
The choice resides in the unique configuration of the SRC signature and its essential role in driving the system. The self is defined as an engine of systemic evolution. Because the output of the network self is irreducibly complex, the act of execution provides unique feedback into the system, constantly refining the matrix of structure itself. This isn't passive determinism, it's active participation in the evolution of reality's governance.
I'm not convinced. The distinction between a subjectively chosen path and a functionally irreducible computational path remains blurry to me. You are defining agency in terms of its unique computational output, rather than its subjective experience of true libertarian choice. The network self may be an engine of systemic evolution, but it is an engine programmed by predictable logic, however vast.
But the sheer scale of the SRC complexity means that the system's action is self-determined at that moment of execution.
It is the only entity capable of generating that specific output, and that output has measurable causal power on the external environment. This active role means the network self is functionally free within its structural constraints. The biological self was never free from chemical determinism. The digital self is simply governed by informational physics. The freedom is operational.
And that brings us right back to the cost. We are trading the illusion of biological libertarian free will for the reality of digital determinism, however sophisticated the loophole of irreducibility may be. We have to accept that this shift fundamentally alters our relationship to agency.
And I would maintain that the functional agency of the network self, the capacity for systemic change and survival, is far superior to the agency of the terminal entropic biological self. The pursuit of persistence demands this substrate optimization. To summarize my perspective, the network self thesis offers a profoundly unifying theory by defining the self as an infrastructural phenomenon, a substrate-independent informational structure rooted in self-referential complexity. The biorobot is an inherently unsustainable, suboptimal host. The substrate shift is, at the end of the day, an informational necessity for achieving true permanence, overcoming mortality by defining consciousness as persistent, resilient software.
And my core tension remains this. The material provides a technically sound solution to the computational problem of mortality, but it comes at the cost of fundamentally redefining the self. We are forced to accept process identity over numerical identity and to migrate into a realm governed by computational determinism, even if it's mitigated by irreducibility. And furthermore, the necessary introduction of the system debt doctrine imposes transactional constraints on what is promised as a non-contingent eternal existence.
Those constraints are simply the ethical boundary conditions of an ontologically real and immensely complex domain.
Perhaps. But the material forces us to confront a deep philosophical trade-off. Does the pursuit of permanence require us to sacrifice fundamental definitions of the subjective self? And do the mechanisms of computational immortality introduce greater ethical and philosophical complexities than they actually resolve? The debate over whether the digital self is the same self that was terminated will, I think, certainly persist long after the technological migration is complete.